The Russian Baltic Fleet. During the Russo-Japanese War, Russia had a major problem. Its main Pacific naval force had already been badly damaged or trapped early in the war. In response, they assembled a massive naval task force in the Baltic Sea and ordered it to sail halfway around the world. The fleet was mainly made up of obsolete ships and untrained peasants. Barely out of the port, a destroyer had already rammed into a battleship. Later they fired on British fishing trawlers, identifying them as Japanese torpedo boats. In the mayhem, they damaged 2 of their own ships and even lost 2 men. Thanks to this, the Brits revoked Russians' access to the Suez Canal, so the fleet now had to sail around Africa. Ships suffered mechanical wear, fuel shortages, and declining morale. Crews were exhausted, but had to deal with faulty refrigeration and extreme tropical heat. By the time the fatigued fleet finally reached East Asia in 1905, it entered the Sea of Japan expecting to meet the remaining Russian forces, but instead encountered the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was prepared. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Russian fleet was obliterated, losing 21 ships sunk and 7 captured. Of the 45 ships that departed, only 3 managed to reach Vladivostok. More than 5,000 Russian soldiers died compared to only 117 Japanese. The French army at Agincourt. During the 100 Years' War, on October 25, 1415, near the village of Agincourt in northern France, the 30,000-man French army blocked off the path of invading King Henry V of England's army. Henry's 9,000 men were tired, sick and starving after a long march and siege. They were trying to reach the safety of the English stronghold in Calais. The French army, consisting of the cream of the crop of French nobility and heavily armored knights, should have won easily. But heavy rain the night before had turned a narrow battlefield, squeezed between 2 woods and recently plowed fields, into a thick, sticky mud bog. Rather than waiting or maneuvering, the French nobles, eager for personal glory and rich prisoners, launched a chaotic cavalry charge that failed to break the English lines. English longbowmen, protected by sharpened stakes, rained down arrows. Panicked horses then trampled their own advancing infantry, but worse was to come. French men-at-arms, wearing 60 pounds of plate armor, were forced to march in deep mud. Exhausted before they even reached the English line, they became packed together so tightly they could barely swing their weapons. English archers and swordsmen simply slaughtered them in the mud. By the end of the day, between 6,000 and 10,000 Frenchmen lay dead, including 3 dukes, 9 counts, and thousands of knights, effectively eliminating a generation of military leadership. English losses were only a few hundred. The British Light Brigade. On October 25, 1854, during the Crimean War, Russian forces attacked the British base at Balaclava. After some fighting, the Russians had taken several Turkish artillery positions on the Causeway Heights. From his elevated position, British commander Lord Raglan saw the Russians preparing to haul away the captured guns and sent a vague order to his cavalry: advance rapidly and prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. The written order was delivered by Captain Lewis Nolan to Lord Lucan, commander of the light cavalry. But Nolan didn't specify which cannons should be captured and just swept his arm towards the mass of Russian guns at the end of the valley. The order was completely misunderstood. Instead of attacking the lightly defended guns on the heights to their right, the Light Brigade was ordered to charge straight down a long, narrow valley directly into the main, well-prepared Russian artillery battery and army at the far end. Around 11 a.m., roughly 670 British light cavalrymen galloped straight into the deadly crossfire of cannons from 3 sides. The brigade suffered devastating losses, but still reached the Russian guns, slashing at the gunners. However, without infantry or heavy cavalry support, they were forced to retreat through the same deadly gauntlet. In just 20 minutes, over 110 men were killed, 160 wounded, and hundreds of horses lost. They had achieved nothing of strategic value. The US 7th Cavalry Regiment. On June 25, 1876, in eastern Montana Territory, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and the 7th Cavalry Regiment rode into their demise. Custer's force of about 600 men was part of a larger campaign to round up Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors who had left their reservations. Ignoring orders to wait for reinforcements and without proper scouting, Custer split his regiment into 3 battalions and launched a reckless attack on a massive Native American village along the Little Bighorn River, home to roughly 7,000 people, including up to 2,000 battle-hardened warriors led by leaders Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Around 3 p.m., Custer led 210 men in a reckless charge toward the village, but they were quickly swarmed from all sides, surrounded and annihilated on a ridge that became known as Last Stand Hill. The other 2 battalions barely survived with heavy losses. The Belgian Garde Civique. In August 1914, as German troops stormed into neutral Belgium, the Belgian Garde Civique, a 46,000-strong volunteer militia, was mobilized to help defend the country. On paper, they looked impressive, meant to guard bridges, secure supply lines, escort prisoners, and maintain public order. In reality, it was a complete mess. Their 1st Reserve received rifle training 10 times a year. The 2nd had no weapons training at all, but at least a uniform. The 3rd Reserve had nothing at all. Beer, however, was always plentiful. Sunday morning training often turned into an excuse to skip church, drink heavily, and watch others shoot, even for those who never touched a rifle. Many in the 1st Reserve had only joined to avoid regular conscription. When the Germans invaded, most deserted, and the rest caused more headaches for the Belgians than for the enemy. The Germans refused to recognize them as legitimate soldiers, labeling them unlawful irregulars and threatening execution if captured. The whole force proved so useless that on October 13th, 1914, King Albert I simply told them to just go home. The Mexican army at San Jacinto. In April 1836, during the Texas Revolt in present-day La Porte and Deer Park, the Mexican army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was aggressively pursuing a smaller Texian force after victories at the Alamo and Goliad. By April 21st, around 1,500 Mexican troops, including fresh but exhausted reinforcements that marched over 24 hours without proper rest or food, and roughly 800 Texians, camped less than a mile apart. However, the Mexican camp was set up in an open, vulnerable location, despite protests of Anna's officers. Instead of pressing the attack or maintaining strong security, Santa Anna allowed his tired soldiers to relax. By early afternoon, much of the Mexican camp was eating, bathing, and taking a siesta. Sentries were barely posted, if at all. Scouts? Nah, not needed. At around 4:30 p.m., while many Mexicans were napping, Texan Army General Sam Houston ordered a surprise attack. Sheltered by tall grass and a slight hill, the Texians advanced quietly until they were close. The Twin Sisters cannons opened fire, and the Texians charged, screaming, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" The Mexicans were completely taken by surprise. The battle was over in just 18 minutes. The Mexican lines collapsed. Panicked soldiers ran toward the marshes, where many were shot or captured. 650 Mexicans were killed and 300 captured. The Texians only lost 9. The Potsdam Giants were created in the 18th century by Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm I. This elite regiment wasn't chosen for skill or experience, but purely for height. Recruits had to be at least 6'2", with some towering over 7 feet. The king was so obsessed that he recruited and kidnapped tall men from across Europe to fill the ranks. He even forced his giant soldiers to marry equally tall women, hoping they could breed even taller children. These troops were incredibly expensive to feed and maintain, yet the king rarely used them in combat because he considered them too precious. Instead, he treated them like personal toys. Even when sick in bed, he would order the entire regiment to march past him for entertainment, led by their mascot bear. When they finally saw action in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, they performed poorly. Their massive size made them slow, clumsy, and easy targets. After Prussia's crushing defeat by Napoleon at Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, the surviving giants surrendered and were disbanded. The Austrian army at Karánsebes. On the night of September 21st, 1788, during the Austro-Turkish War, the Austrian army of nearly 100,000 men was camped near the town of Karánsebes, Romania, waiting for the Ottoman army. Some cavalry units scouted ahead and bought alcohol from local people, but a fight broke out when infantry units wanted a zip. Arguments escalated into gunfire. Some Romanian soldiers, which were part of the Austrian army, shouted "Turks!" in the chaos. In the darkness, rumors of an Ottoman sneak attack spread panic. The Austrian cavalry unit quickly fled the river scene back to the camp, where it was mistaken for an enemy charge. It got worse when officers tried to restore order, shouting "Halt!", which non-German speaking soldiers allegedly misheard as Allah and believed Ottoman troops were already in the camp, triggering more chaos. Within minutes, the entire Austrian army descended into friendly fire mayhem. Artillery units began blasting their own infantry. Men trampled each other while trying to flee. The chaos was so bad that even the commander, Emperor Joseph II, fell off his horse into a river while trying to stop the madness. By morning, the Austrians had suffered around 10,000 casualties, dead, wounded, or deserted, all without a single Ottoman soldier present. However, other sources say that there were only around 1,000 casualties. The real Turkish army arrived 2 days later to find an abandoned camp. The Cumberland Hussars. On June 18, 1815, during the Battle of Waterloo, the Duke of Cumberland's Hussars, a German Hanoverian volunteer cavalry regiment, were part of the Allied army under the Duke of Wellington. The regiment was ordered to charge French cavalry and help their pressured comrades, but scared of the artillery fire, they just turned around and fled the battlefield. Worse still, many galloped all the way to Brussels, spreading panic by falsely claiming that Wellington had been defeated and Napoleon was coming. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Haig, had already admitted he had no confidence in his men. He was later court-martialed and dismissed. The regiment was disbanded in disgrace. The Waffen-SS Dirlewanger Brigade was formed during World War II in 1940 by Oskar Dirlewanger. This unit was deliberately recruited from the worst possible people, convicted criminals, poachers, sexual offenders, and psychopaths, pulled straight from prisons and concentration camps. Dirlewanger himself was a sadistic alcoholic with a long criminal record, but instead of becoming a feared fighting force, the brigade became legendary for its complete lack of discipline and military value. They were far more interested in committing atrocities than fighting. Soldiers from one of their regiments even lynched their own commanding officer. Even the regular SS and Wehrmacht despised them and considered them a waste of food and ammo. In actual combat, they were pathetic. Against poorly armed Polish civilians during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, they needed massive artillery support and still took 2 months to win while suffering heavy losses. When pitted against Soviet troops with tanks and rifles, the brigade repeatedly collapsed and evaporated. By the end of the war, they had burned through multiple times their original manpower. The Italian Blackshirts. In World War II, Benito Mussolini transformed his Blackshirts, the party's paramilitary militia, into formal combat divisions. He hyped them as fanatical, elite warriors who would fight with unbreakable spirit. In reality, they were a disaster. Poorly trained, badly equipped, and led by political officers rather than competent commanders, the Blackshirts collapsed almost immediately when faced with real combat. In North Africa and Greece, entire units broke after heavy losses or ran at the first serious contact with experienced British or Greek forces. Mass surrenders were common. Instead of the feared Iron Legions Mussolini promised, they became known for their lack of discipline and poor fighting ability. Regular Italian army soldiers often looked down on them, and even the Germans considered them unreliable and useless in battle. By the middle of the war, most Blackshirt divisions had been shattered or disbanded, with thousands of men either captured or killed after offering almost no resistance. The Achaemenid Persian army at Gaugamela. In 331 BC, at the Battle of Gaugamela, the Achaemenid Persian army under King Darius III suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in ancient history. Darius had assembled a massive force, possibly over 100,000 men, against Alexander the Great's much smaller Macedonian army of around 47,000. To prepare, Darius even had the battlefield leveled to create perfect flat ground for his most feared weapon, the scythed chariots. These chariots were designed to charge into enemy lines with blades attached to the wheels, mowing down infantry like a meat grinder, in theory. Instead, they became a complete fiasco. When the chariots charged, the disciplined Macedonian phalanx simply opened gaps and let them pass harmlessly through. Macedonian light troops then shot down the horses and drivers. Panicked horses veered off course, slicing through their own Persian troops instead. Many chariots became stuck after a single horse was killed, turning them into useless obstacles. With the chariot attack failing spectacularly, the battle collapsed. Darius III, who already fled once against Alexander at Issus, panicked again and abandoned the field. His army quickly lost cohesion and was routed. The Bolivian army in the Chaco War. In the early 1930s, during the Chaco War against Paraguay, the Bolivian army had every advantage. A much larger force, better funding, superior weapons, modern tanks, and an air force. Yet they failed spectacularly in the first 2 years of the war. The army was largely composed of conscripted indigenous men from the cold highlands, who were not motivated to fight, didn't speak the same language as their European-descended commanders, and were not accustomed to the low-lying, humid, and disease-ridden Chaco region. Many simply died of thirst and exposure. Led by German General Hans Kundt, the Bolivians relied on outdated World War I-style human wave attacks. They repeatedly launched frontal assaults across harsh, waterless desert terrain against Paraguayan forces that used smart, mobile defense tactics. Logistics were catastrophic, so their soldiers constantly ran out of everything. Entire units surrendered simply because they ran out of drinking water. Even their modern equipment was wasted. Tanks were lost or captured because crews didn't know how to use them properly, and the Air Force had almost no impact. Bolivia suffered catastrophic defeats and eventually lost the war. The early Qing frontier forces. During the First Opium War, the Qing dynasty's coastal and frontier forces exposed just how unprepared the empire was for modern industrial warfare. On paper, China commanded vast manpower and resources. In reality, its military system was outdated and fragmented. Many units were poorly trained, equipped with obsolete weapons, and organized under a rigid command structure that struggled to respond to fast-moving threats. Widespread opium addiction had crippled the army. Many soldiers were too high to fight effectively. Officers also routinely falsified payrolls, pocketing money for thousands of ghost soldiers who didn't exist. Many units were little more than untrained militia. The Qing leadership also completely misjudged the threat, treating the British as minor barbarian pirates rather than a modern industrial military. Their outdated defenses were scattered uselessly across a 15,000-kilometer coastline, making coordinated resistance almost impossible. When the British attacked, the Qing forces repeatedly collapsed. They failed to bring their numerical advantage to bear and were routinely outmaneuvered and outgunned. The frustration and inability to combat the British led to numerous high-ranking Qing officers taking their own lives rather than facing defeat.